Hi, this is Harry McGee of the Irish Times political staff with the weekly political videocast. It's been a momentous week this week in Irish politics. In fact, most weeks this year have been momentous weeks in Irish politics, but we've had the budget over 2 days for the first time ever on Monday and Tuesday. Today is Wednesday, and tomorrow the focus shifts to Brussels and what is being billed as a life-changing treaty change, possibly for the euro. But I'm delighted to be joined in the Irish Times studio by two TDs. First of all, the Labour TD for Dublin Midwest, Joanna Tuffy, and also the Independent TD for Wicklow, Stephen Donnelly. We're going to discuss the budget, and we're also going to discuss the upcoming European Summit. So perhaps I could start with you, Joanna, and your reaction to the budget and the controversy that was caused by the cuts in disability allowance.
Well, I think overall, like the budget, there's a lot of things that are positive in it that I think that the Labour Party ministers fought very hard for. I was very pleased that child benefit was left as a universal payment and that the standard rate of payment was left untouched. There was no changes there was no cuts in the basic rates of social welfare. There was some initiatives that I would have noticed immediately. There's a proposal to have a targeted limited recruitment in the public sector. That's in the context of the shedding of staff, and I think that's a good thing, because I know, when I left college back at the end of the 1980s, you need, as a person, who's looking for work, you need a bit of hope. So even if you don't get the jobs, you need to have jobs, and I think the public sector does play a role in that regard. So that was one initiative. I think the initiative as well that employers have to pay more of the costs of redundancy payments, I think that's welcome, because I would be very aware as a public representative that employers would let people go and then take on new people at maybe worse salary and conditions, or they might take on the same people again under contract and so on. So definitely the redundancy payments was being abused, it was being exploited, I think, by employers, and I think that there's a saving to the state in that regard, and I think it's better, because I think employers will try harder to hold on to people because of that change. There are other steps as well in the budget that would welcome. There has been a certain amount done to widen the tax base in terms of people who make property out of rental income, very high earners.
The PRSI base, yes.
Yes, extending the PRSI base. There's the minimum rate, the minimum percentage of tax that higher earners must pay has been increased from 27 to 30%. So that's whatever tax reliefs they use, they'll still have to pay 30% on their income. So things like that are very welcome. I think there's been other stuff to do now. There's a whole list of things, and
Okay, I just told you there because if we were to go through everything, we'd be here all day. There were so many leaks surrounding this budget that we almost got Evelyn Cusack kind of issuing a monsoon warning on the RTE weather forecast for weeks. We had weeks. It was the most extensively leaked budget that I can recall, and still, after all of that, there were so many climb downs. There was a climb down on children's benefit. There was the climb down on employers paying the first 4 weeks of an employee's sick leave. There was also the climb down on a higher rate of tax in compensation for the abolition of the lowest rate of universal social charge, or USC. And then in the last 24 hours, we've had this embarrassing climb down and reverse in relation to the disability allowance. The strategy started going skyways, didn't it?
Yeah, I would be very unhappy about the measures that were leaked, and I'm not really sure who's behind it and what's the intention. You see, very often as a backbench TD, I would read about things at the same time as everybody else in the papers. I wouldn't know if it was true, if it was kite flying, if it was mischievous. You just wouldn't know. So I think that aspect to the budget was very unhelpful. I think it, it certainly scared people in the public, and I don't think that's a good idea. I think it was damaging actually to the government. So I think it's a bad way to handle the budget. So that's just my own response to that. I've no difficulty with the issues being debated. I'm not sure if there was ever a change to child benefit under consideration or not. I just don't know. I do welcome that there's a bit of a debate about that, and I still think more has to be done, because personally I feel very strongly that child benefit should be a universal payment, as it has been since 1943, because children are extra people that the parents have to feed and clothe, and I think we should recognise that as a society. but I think the general thing, I don't think it was at all helpful, and I'd love to know who is behind it. What's the intention? Is it deliberate? Is it a strategy by the government? I just don't know, and I certainly would disagree with it.
All of those things, I would say, in my own personal opinion, from having received some of them. Stephen, your own reaction to the budget, and I know that there were a couple of issues that you felt particularly strongly about. Perhaps the disability allowance is the first one. The second is that you also believed that a more tax for the highest earners should have been introduced in the budget in the interest of equality.
I do. I found the total amount that the government went for, 3.8 billion, reasonable. I think actually there is an argument to go further. There's analysis in the Irish Times today by Dan O'Brien suggesting that it is the lowest correction of the 5 sort of distressed Eurozone countries at the moment. It is the lowest correction. So I accept that this is painful. There's no easy way of getting out of this, and people need to pay. What I was very surprised at, however, is that this is a regressive budget. And that's not my opinion. Like, mathematically, it is when you don't touch income tax, accepting that there was a good measure at the lowest end on universal social charge, when you basically don't touch income tax, you bring in flat rate charges, you bring in increases to VAT. By definition, that is a regressive tax. On VAT, for example, the lowest decile of income earners spend 3 times more of their income than the highest decile on goods that are going up from 21 to 23%. So obviously a household charge at €100 is more out of the income for low earners and higher. So a regressive budget, and I think that's very disappointing. I would be disinclined towards regressive budgets in most cases. I think in a situation where we were dealing with extraordinary hardship all over the place, but obviously particularly for the nearly 500,000 people unemployed and their dependents, and people on low incomes, I just think it is wrong. I don't think it reflects Irish social values to bring in these kind of things. And therefore, what do you do? Well, therefore, if I'm saying, look, first of all, leave disabled teenagers alone. I mean, come off it. And in fairness to the government, they pulled back on that straight away. That was clearly just a mistake. I don't know what I was doing in there. Lone parents are being attacked, and I am as angry about the lone parent payment as I am about the disability. The logic says this. It says if you're a lone parent, usually a single mum, bringing up a kid, economic theory says, well, you're not in the productive sector, you're in the unproductive sector. I would argue that probably the most important productive thing you do socially and economically is raise kids to be, good, law-abiding, sort of happy, well-balanced people. This budget is going to say next year at 12 years of age, single mum, single dad, you're not getting it. And then in 2014, it'll be at 7 years of age. Now, I've got 2 young children. They're kind of 1 and 2. But unless something weird happens to kids at 7 years of age, that they don't need to be fed or clothed anymore, that I am as yet unaware of, I don't understand this. It seems like a horrific thing to do. However, if I'm going to say, please take your hands off disabled kids and please take your hands off lone parents, I accept I have to come up with others. So, is it reasonable in a time of national emergency to add a few percentage points to earners of, let's say, over 120,000, 150,000? I would say yes, it is. I don't know many people earning over 150,000. I do know a small number. I'm pretty sure that if I said to them, look, here's the deal. This is a 4-year tax only. It is an emergency tax. The situation we're in is we can take this off you, or we can turn off the heat in pensioners' houses for the extra 6 weeks because, as you know, the fuel allowance has been pulled back by 6 weeks. I'm pretty sure that they would say, take the money. So within that context, I would say yes. I think there is.
Would you impose it as a USC type charge or as just an emergency income tax per se? I know it doesn't make any difference in terms of.
I don't know, but I would certainly. It would need to be time bound, and at the same time, it has to be sold well. Like, we do have to recognise that we have, I think, the most progressive tax system in the Eurozone and possibly in the OECD. So the high earners do contribute an awful lot. But let's recognise that and say, unfortunately, hey, look, this is a national emergency. There's other places now. Peter Matthews submitted a parliamentary question on the income tax, and it was what would 5% at over 150,000 do? And the figure came back 520 million. That's a heap of cash, right? Michael Noonan's is looking for $1 billion in tax. Well, there's half of it. Or let's only even do half of that. Well, there's a quarter of it. There's another thing that's coming in next year, which I just think is wrong, which is the increments. So public sector workers are going to get automatic pay rises.
Yeah.
The figure I heard, we haven't been able to source it, but the figure I heard, it was on the front line, was about 320
million.
million.
Bernardo's brought it up, and I was listening to Brendan Howland this morning, was saying that the unions have said it's not in the Croke Park deal, so they've set themselves against it. There's nothing that Stephen has said there that you could argue against, really, Joanna.
Well,
why wasn't there this tax for high earners?
I agree with some of what Stephen is saying, and I disagree with other parts of it. I don't think that you could have a cast a verdict now that it was an aggressive budget. I mean, I think more could be done in terms of progressive taxation measures in the budget, but there has been a fair amount, of things done to try and broaden the tax break and to start targeting wealth more, through our tax system. So, there's that side of it. I think you would need to look at the budget at the end of it and see how much it has either reduced or widened the gap in incomes in our society, and that's a job that has yet to be done. Similarly, I think on the social welfare, I think it's very important in terms of the whole idea of income equality to protect the basic social welfare payments. But at the same time, our social welfare system has a lot of layering. There's lots of people where they get double payments, and things have been added on to different groups of the years. So some people in social welfare just get the standard pension, for example, and other people get a whole load of different kind of benefits. And there isn't enough information about what some people are actually getting in terms of all those benefits, because there's not joined up information about that. And there is a need to reform, for example, the payments to lone parents. You do want to support lone parents, and you want to support people with children, but at the same time you don't want to be incentivising people, so in such a way that it's a catch-22, that if they go out to work they lose this, and then they won't go out to work because they'll lose that, and they're getting their rent paid for and all of these different type of things, where they might be in a situation where they would have otherwise gone out and become educated and got into the workforce. What I mean? I appreciate the logic. I think the problem with that was laid out very clearly for me in the appendix to the budget. They do these case studies of, this is John and he earns 40 grand, and one of them was the single mum. I think it said, this is Laura, she has a 2-year-old kid and she earns 20,000 euros. And it said, look, her income's going to be pretty much untouched. She's going to have the 100 euro household charge. Well, as I was sitting in the Dole listening to the speeches yesterday, I said, okay, well, Laura needs childcare, and she has to pay minimum wage for, let's say, 32 hours, and she has to pay employers PRSI. Yeah. Well, that comes to 19,750 euros. Yeah. So Laura's wage is taxable is 250 euros. Yeah, but what you don't get in that type of picture is that some people in certain areas will get community childcare, whereas other people have to pay for private, or some people get their rent paid for them, whereas other people have to pay their rent or pay their mortgage. There's different kinds of lone parents.
Yeah, the reform project has been trying to iron out those.
And you see, Joan worked as minister. Joan in the past was a very reforming, progressive Minister of State and Social Welfare, and that is exactly what she's trying to do now in a much more difficult economic situation. So I think I do agree with Stephen in terms of the overall approach. And one point I would make is this idea that our taxation system is one of the most progressive. That isn't true, because if you look at documents by task and that, we don't collect as much income tax as other countries. We don't collect property tax. There's many other taxes that would target wealth and so on that we don't actually, and we have more income inequality than many countries.
Sure, but the point that Stephen was making in relation to VAT and to property tax, that they're all flat. So that if you're earning a minimal amount of money, you're paying the same as rich as people in our society. They say that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose, and this week I think the coalition has had a bite of a reality sandwich as to what it's really like to govern the property tax reliefs, which both parties railed against before the election. They've realised that they're going to have to retain some of them to prevent a meltdown. There's also been a rollback in relation to upward-only rent review, and there have also been other climb downs, most notably in relation to burning the bondholders. There's another big payment due for Anglo of 1.2 billion in the new year that they're going to have to swallow hard and take. Yeah. Both parties took a far more assertive position in the run-up to the election in relation to Europe. There's a crucial summit this weekend. What's your opinion as to what the government should do, should seek, and should achieve at the summit this weekend?
Well, I think what the government should look for is, it should look for things that help the countries in Europe immediately. There's no point thinking that we can just have, say, a referendum on the European treaties immediately. People, like, if there is such a proposal, in the future, there's going to have to be a proper debate and a proper referendum on it and so on. I don't know. I don't know, to be honest, because I am worried about aspects of closer integration in Europe. And I mean, one of the things you're looking at in Europe is that, like, I think in the overall project, democracy has actually been undermined. Like, you look at governments like the whole thing of technocratic governments, being put in place in some countries, at the behest of the European Union. You're looking at, all these unelected people that would make decisions, for the rest of us. So, like, I am fearful of that, and I am fearful of closer integration in that regard. Now, at the same time, I do think that the European Union countries should cooperate to try and put things right. I mean, there's another issue as well. Like, I would be very sympathetic with the views actually of Paul Krugman, and this idea that there needs to be stimulus. And I don't think Ireland or any of the other countries can do it on their own. And I think the European Union is going to need to take measures in terms of stimulus, like it did in the past. Like, the whole European Social Fund would have helped Ireland hugely in the past in terms of the development of our institutes of technology, the funding of courses, and things like that, which were very much putting us in the right direction up to the mid-1990s. So, like, I mean, I think there's more of that needs to be sought by our government at European Union.
Disastrously, in the context of an interview between two sparring politicians, I think you're probably singing out of the same hymn book as Stephen Donnelly in that regard. Stephen, you've made the argument that we've already ceded monetary independence to Europe once we went into the euro. If the Germans and the French get their way and get a very strong agreement in terms of a fiscal arrangement, we might be ceding fiscal sovereignty as well. You're saying that when you cede both, you kind of look at and say, well, where is the state, or do we have a state anymore? And is this one of the fears that you have going into this weekend?
I do. It's a fear I have with the entire process. I think if we do end up ceding fiscal and monetary control, it is not credible to call ourselves a republic anymore. We would be a state within a federalised Europe, essentially controlled by France and Germany. And the French and Germans aren't making any, they're not even pretending anymore that that's not the case. Sarkozy talks about intergovernmentalism. They meet in private, they come up with a pact, and they are now basically putting a gun to the head, from what I can see, of Ireland and other European countries. They both concern me. Germany actually concerns me much more, because what Germany is doing is saying, look, the tools are all in place to solve this. The ECB can begin to print money. It can be this final backstop or firewall. What that means is it buys up all of the distressed stuff around Europe, and it quietly the countries don't necessarily have to pay them back over a 10 or 20 year period, or pay a certain amount back. That's all in place. The ECB is governed by a 2% inflation target that can be increased, which would allow them to do it, to do what they need to do. Germany appears to me to be saying we are vetoing the solution to this, and we have vetoed it for 2 years. We will continue to veto it. Actually, we, Germany, have caused an awful lot of the problem. We have bankrupted you, Ireland. There's no reason for you to be in an IMF bailout. But hey, when the ECB and we insisted that you pay 100 billion euros worth of private sector debt that was never yours, of course you got locked out of the markets, right? So Germany has essentially, I believe, forced us into bankruptcy, and is now saying we are vetoing the options that are there until you start signing over some of your economic sovereignty. I'm very worried, because the logic I hear, I've twice or three times heard the Taoiseach put forward now, and he said it in the State of the Union address, or State of the Nation address. He said Ireland is in favour of stronger European economic governance, right? And he said, because that will stop us repeating the mistakes of the past. Now, what does that mean? That means, in order for us not to pull another Fianna Fáil, we should give the ability to do that to somebody else. That's what that means, right? Now, what we're going to start hearing from the government, from Minister Crichton and from the Taoiseach and from the Taoiseach is, sure, look, all we're signing up to is a 3% deficit to GDP ratio. Sure, that was in the Maastricht Treaty. And maybe the 60% of total debt to GDP. Sure, that was in the Maastricht Treaty. So there's no real problem here. All we're doing is giving teeth to existing treaties. And sure, if we had obeyed those in the first place, we wouldn't be in this situation. Well, it turns out that is completely untrue. During the bubble, when the foundations for this entire catastrophe were being laid, at one point our debt to GDP ratio fell as low as 24.8%. And we ran a budget surplus the entire time. So nothing that we were doing would have violated any of these rules. In fact, we would have looked like one of the healthiest economies in Europe. So therefore, what kind of power do you actually need to stop Fianna Fáil doing what it did? Well, you would need someone to come in and say, your income tax base is too low. I think you need to tax lower earners. Your corporation tax, not happy with that either. We think maybe you should increase it. We need you to ramp up stamp duty because you're overexposed to income from the construction sector, and so forth. In other words, you basically give all financial control to somebody else. So I believe we are on a very shaky road. I saw a quote from James Madison the other day, who was one of the authors of the US Constitution, and it said, federalize their wallets and their hearts and minds will follow. That's what it feels like to me. I am a supporter of the European project, but I think it has moved too quickly. I think there is a democratic deficit at the heart of Europe. We have an unelected technocrat ruling Italy. We have an unelected technocrat ruling Greece. We have an unelected technocrat called AJ Chopra and his crew, not ruling Ireland, but with vast influence in Ireland.
Correcting our homework, I think, is
right.
the phrase that Pat Rappert used.
Yeah, we have the German Parliament getting a look at budget proposals before Joanna and myself, as Irish TDs, get to see them. Where I started to get nervous was the European Constitution. It was put to the French and they voted no. It was put to the Dutch, I think, and they voted no. The polls said we were going to vote no. The polls said the English were going to vote no by about 80%. When I was in grad school in Boston, Bertie Ahern gave a talk. It was when he was doing his speech in the joint houses of the Senate and the Congress. And he was asked this, and he basically said, yeah, look, we wanted to get this through. A lot of people were going to vote no, so we pretty much changed the name. And he said, you don't get a vote anymore. The only people who got a vote were us. We voted no, and then it was put to us again, and we voted yes. When you put all of that together, I think what is happening is there is a European elite who are pushing for a federal Europe. I think they're quite open about it. I mean, Sarkozy said something like, we are going to use the crisis in Greece in order to further the goal of further fiscal union or further, and so forth. I think they are moving much quicker than the people of Europe are comfortable with. I think the people in Ireland are happy kind of going to that, but not this quickly.
Do you think, just finally and just briefly from both of you, do you think we're heading into the direction of a referendum? Do you think that the referendum will be unavoidable and necessary to effect any treaty change? Stephen?
I'm reading in the papers this morning that what they're trying to do is find ways of treaty change without putting it to the people, because I think the Taoiseach has probably told them, listen, you guys are not very popular in Ireland right now, so it will be a no vote. I hope it doesn't go to referendum, not because they found some sneaky way of avoiding the democratic process, but because they say, actually, you know what, Germany, this is not how we should do this. Let's take 20 years to do it.
Okay, Joanne?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't like to see a referendum happen too fastly. I think at the end of the day, if there's a referendum, well, the people will cast their verdict, and that's the way it is. But I think if it's rushed, there won't be a proper debate, and people will be scared into it. I don't think that would be the right approach. And I always felt like with Lisbon that was probably the kind of, the time we should stop and actually start to think, what powers do we want? And we need to, instead of it be kind of forced upon us more or less from Europe, and this is the way it is, that we should think, look, as Irish citizens, what powers do we want to exercise, how do we want to exercise them, and then look at our place in the European project.
Okay, we mightn't have all that much time, because Merkel and Sarkozy said on Monday that they hoped that the ratification process might be in a position to start next March, which isn't all that long away once you get over Christmas. Stephen Donnelly, Joanna Tuffy, thank you both very much for coming in. If you want to read more about politics in the Irish Times, or want to see more indeed, all you have to do is visit our website, www.irishtimes.com.